Food is something that affects everyone, every day. It's a local, national, and global issue. When we talk about food, we are also discussing health, farming, land, water, and the reality of changing weather patterns. Food is not only about big business, but also personal economics, as we all want to be able to afford to eat in a healthy manner. It's clear that the health of our community is directly related to how well our community eats. That's why local food TV and radio are here to bring you the latest news about food. We'll also have intelligent panel discussions and conversations with policymakers, scientists, advocates, and food entrepreneurs. Join us each week for the latest edition of local food TV and radio. Let's get started. Welcome to Local Food TV and Radio. I'm your host, Derek Samaras, bringing you the latest news in the world of food. This week, we begin with a story out of China, where a recent article from Foreign Policy reported that the country's farmland may be in serious trouble. China's massive population consumes a tremendous amount of food each day, including grain, edible oil, vegetables, and meat. The Chinese Communist Party has long recognized the importance of food security, particularly following the devastating famines of the Maoist era. In recent years, the CCP has focused heavily on protecting farmland and promoting high-standard farming practices. According to Tang Renjian, China's Minister of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, every day, China's 1.4 billion people consume a staggering 700,000 tons of grain, 98,000 tons of edible oil, 1.92 million tons of vegetables, and 230,000 tons of meat. But despite these efforts, recent reports suggest that China's farmland is under threat from a range of factors. Climate change, pollution, and rapid urbanization are all contributing to the degradation of farmland across the country. Additionally, the government's aggressive push to modernize agriculture has led to the consolidation of farmland and the displacement of small farmers, further exacerbating the problem. The consequences of China's shrinking farmland could be severe, as the world's most populous country is heavily reliant on domestic food production to feed its people. If farmlands continue to shrink, the country could be forced to rely on expensive imports to meet its food needs. This could drive up prices and exacerbate food insecurity, particularly for low-income families. The Chinese government has recognized the severity of the problem and has taken steps to address it. However, experts suggest that more needs to be done to protect China's farmland and ensure the country's long-term food security. Next, we have a story from the USA about new labeling requirements for meat products. The Associated Press reports that federal agricultural officials have released new labeling requirements for meat, poultry, or eggs that would allow the label "Product of USA" only if the animals are born, raised, slaughtered, and processed in the United States. This is a significant change from the current policy, which allows voluntary use of such labels on products from animals that have been imported from foreign countries and slaughtered in the USA. The proposed rule has been praised by consumer advocates and representatives of U.S. ranchers and farmers. The U.S. Cattlemen's Association, which petitioned the USDA for the label change in 2019, has welcomed the new rule, according to the group's president, Justin Tupper. The proposed rule accurately defines what these voluntary origin claims mean. He added that consumers have the right to know where their food comes from. Director of Food Policy for the Consumer Federation of America, Thomas Gramillion, has called the change a small but important step that should have been made long ago. Under the current rule, a cow can be raised in Mexico under that country's regulation for feed and medications, shipped across the border, and slaughtered the same day to make ground beef and steaks and qualify as product of USA. The existing rule also penalizes small domestic producers. According to Carrie Balcom, executive director of the trade group American Grass-Fed Association, she added that large producers were importing animals raised elsewhere and just repackaging them, and then coasting on the Made in the USA label. However, an official with the North American Meat Institute, which represents large firms that process most of the meat and poultry products sold in the USA, has expressed concerns about the new rule for raising prices for consumers. And the industry group, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, has called for eliminating the voluntary USA labels entirely and allowing for strict labeling standards verified by the USDA. Next, we'll be taking a look at the volatile outlook of agricultural commodities. Experts at the International Sweetener Colloquium in La Quinta, California, on March 1st stated that war, weather, economic tensions, and tight global supplies are driving volatility across multiple commodities. Global dairy markets saw a sharp decline in global dairy products in 2021 and 2022, and analysts are forecasting a slow recovery for current and future dairy markets worldwide. According to Mary Ledman, the global strategist for dairy at Rabobank, during the pandemic, dairy farmers across the world were signaled to produce more products. However, weather, diminished export opportunities, and higher feed costs have pressured recent production. Recent shipments to China, the world's largest importer of dairy goods, have also impacted production in exporting countries. But U.S. exports of some dairy products, like butterfat, actually increased last year. The United States is picking up the market's share of exports, explained Ledman. U.S. exports of butterfat were expected to increase nearly 9% since U.S. prices are currently some of the lowest in the world. Global stocks for grain and oilseeds were still tight amid continually strong demand, and the outlook for those markets remained uncertain. According to Stephen Nicholson, the executive vice president and global sector strategist for grains and oilseeds at Rabo Research, food and agribusiness, there are many swing factors in play, from what's going to happen to the economy to unstable geopolitical situations. One major market factor Nicholson touched on was weather, saying drought continues to impact major grain-producing areas in several countries, including the United States. In conclusion, with the ongoing effects of the pandemic, weather patterns, and global tensions, it is vital to understand that agricultural commodity markets remain unpredictable. In other news, the Natural Products Expo West, also known as the Super Bowl of the consumer packaged goods industry. This 5-day trade show and conference brings together tens of thousands of people from the natural and organic food and beverage industry to launch, taste, sell, promote, and negotiate products. The expo is being held at the Anaheim Convention Center in California. And this year, we're seeing a significant focus on vegan and alternative protein, with over 3,100 exhibiting booths and an estimated 60,000 participants. This is the place to be for brands in the natural and plant-based space. According to the nonprofit, the Good Food Institute, over 100 alternative protein companies are exhibiting at the show, with the vast majority of them using plant-based technology. Additionally, the Plant-Based Foods Association lists 76 of its members as exhibitors, while 25% of the booths feature vegan products. For companies looking to showcase their products, booths at the expo don't come cheap. Forbes reports that booths usually start at around $15,000, and companies can end up spending close to $100,000 when factoring in travel, booth, design, samples, and related costs. Despite the high costs, the expo is a hotbed for emerging brands, food and beverage trends, and new product innovations. Brands are using this opportunity to showcase their products, with a bevy of future food tastings taking place during the show. Overall, the Natural Products Expo West is the place to be for companies looking to showcase their latest products and innovations in the natural and plant-based food industry. And in local news, there are concerns over the end of pandemic-era food assistance and what it means for Colorado's food banks. As of March 2023, people who qualify for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, will no longer receive the maximum legal allotment for their household size. This means that many families in Colorado will see a reduction in their food assistance benefits. According to the Colorado Department of Human Services, the average person receiving SNAP benefits in the state will lose about $90 in assistance per month. That's a roughly $53 million monthly reduction overall. This reduction in benefits is expected to lead to a surge in demand for food banks across the state. Colorado's food banks have been bracing for this eventuality and are working hard to ensure they can meet the increased demand. Since March 2020, when the pandemic hit, people receiving SNAP benefits have been getting emergency allotments, which were supposed to expire when the federal public health emergency ends in May. However, Congress decided to end them early, affecting nearly 30 million people nationwide, including those in Colorado. Currently, about 553,000 people in over 291,000 households in Colorado receive food assistance. In January, monthly payments averaged about $538 per household. This reduction in benefits has already been implemented in 18 states, affecting about 10 million people, and now Colorado is preparing for its own reduction in benefits. That's it for the news. Now it's time to continue our discussion with our local food TV and radio panel. Leading the panel discussion today are Kimberly and Nathan Mudd, the founders and managers of both the Arvada and Westminster, Colorado farmers markets for the last 10 years. Kimberly has an extensive background in accounting and financial reporting, while Nathan is a practicing attorney. Together, they have over 30 years of experience in the local foods industry. Also with us is Vern Tharp, a Colorado businessman with a wide-ranging business background of workouts and turnarounds and deals, dealing with organic farming, to mining operations, to gap-filling weather radars. So let's dive into the discussion. All right, well, joining us is our panel discussion, and we're going to get started here. So we're going to get started with Kimberly first. Kimberly, what is it from this news broadcast that really stood out to you?
It has to be the AP story about proposed rule change regarding product of USA labeling. It's just shocking that we can have product in here in the United States labeled product of USA, but it actually came from somewhere else. The biggest example is meat. Cattle can be raised, fed in a different country, shipped to the United States and processed here, and it can have a product of USA label on it.
You know, I think one of the more interesting nuggets within that story as well is which side of the line certain industries fall on, meaning the support groups. And you have somebody like the Cattlemen's Association, the American Cattlemen's Association, which support this. And then you have a large multinational, no-faced, probably amazingly large group that says, oh, we only support things that make sure that the prices stay low, which means they don't want to mess with them bringing in product from all these other countries and having it have to be labeled, or, you know, I guess some truth behind their labeling. I find that very fascinating, that little nugget within the article.
You know, and their excuse was, well, if we have this bad labeling, we can keep food cheaper. That's their analogy. Big Food has given us some really great things, cheaper food. And we all seem to want cheaper food. The big question is this cheaper food really good for us? Big Food's done some amazing things. They've created some very complex, efficient supply chains with global tentacles. We get cheaper food, they get better, greater profits. But there's two issues here. You know, if you have this global tentacles, it's very difficult for the consumer to understand where their food even came from. And that's really a very critical, fundamental thing for when we're feeding our children and our families and our communities. And it's also leads to the question, is cheaper food really better for us?
Well, Nathan, since I got you now, what stood out to you in this report?
You know, in recent headlines, I'm really surprised and just taken aback about all of the natural phenomenon, the weather phenomenon that's going on right now. We've got our bomb cyclones. We've got our atmospheric rivers. I noticed, I was watching the news recently, and they actually named a winter storm. I've never seen that happen. I mean, unless there's a hurricane or cyclone somewhere in the world, but I've never seen them name a nor'easter. And what's going on with weather generally throughout the world, but more specifically in California, I mean, that is we've got the bread basket in the Midwest, but in California, it's the fruit basket. It's really our vegetable basket too. It's where our food is grown, and just what's going to happen with all of the weather destroying crops. And we need to make sure as a country, and more specifically in Colorado, that we start to become more food sufficient, more self-sufficient. And that could be things like greenhouses. Kimberly and I have met a man in the past. He creates giant 1 acre indoor greenhouses where you farm on these completely under glass. And I mean, it's sufficient for the farmers. The farmers are making a lot of money, but nonetheless, we need to start changing how we look at food growth and really food security. And it needs to be very regionalized and localized.
I want to add a thing that made me think that, you're talking about these large greenhouses that people can grow stuff in, especially in Colorado, because we have good sun year round. And then well, what did they do, decades ago when there weren't greenhouses and there wasn't this large supply chain of food either, and really it kind of gets back to homesteading and people learning how to can more and just save their food, maybe freezing stuff that's in season in the summer. But greenhouses are a great option for all of us now that are ready to eat a banana whenever we want one, or a very ripe tomato whenever we want one. But just how things have changed is interesting.
Well, and that this issue about weather is fundamental. And it really this is kind of nice because it leads into the next segment of our guest that's going to come up. That's going to talk about weather and food. And we do have changing weather patterns that are, a Western rancher knows it, or some farmer in Sudan recognizes that there is just, agriculture likes, decent and moderate weather patterns. And we're seeing that change. And it is going to impact us. Now, growing food in large greenhouses, is one approach. Kimberly's mentioning about, going back to being more seasonal with our eating. It's going to be tough for me to give up my strawberry and shortcake and whipped cream at midnight that I can go to King Soopers to buy. And that's one thing Big Food's done for us. It goes down to at least taking more charge of where our food comes from. And food, we talk about food security. Most people think about, well, that's something, if we have food in the cabinet or, in the refrigerator. But also Nathan's point about food security on a regional scale is important to begin to add to the conversation. I mean, if the planting is interrupted in these big valleys in California, I've gone to King Soopers and couldn't find head of iceberg lettuce. And that could become more and more reality, and really leads well into our next segment of our guest that works for with the National Center for Atmospheric Research.
Well, thanks for that, Vernon. And before we get to the guest, while I have you here, let me just ask you if there were any stories that really stood out to you in this report.
Kimberly's pick on the labeling was a big deal. But also this food is global. not just national, local, it's global. And your article about farmland in China, we're facing something similar in the United States, where every year we have less farmland. It's just reality. We have, less farmland. And to see China having grapple with some of these same issues and having, 10 times the population shows that, the scarcity of food and water, although not Main Street now, and now we talk about other mundane crap, are going to be a big part of our conversation. And we're going to have to, good leaders, good policymakers probably need to get out front on these issues of weather and water and its impact on our populations that they govern. And this is what leads us to the realization that's what's really needed is more local and regionalized food supply chains. So then we can begin to really understand. Now, this is bolt on to big food. We can't replace big food, but we can augment big food by more local and regional food supply chains, and maybe more, even, the organic space.
Yeah, I mean, this article really is really focused on meat production and the labeling for meat production. But let's talk about the organic food, meat and vegetable, right? That labeling is really hard to get for these small regional farmers, like you were talking about. It's so expensive to get organic certified, and a lot of farmers, small farmers, they just say natural because they're not going to pay for this organic certification. But they also aren't using expensive chemicals. They're really mindful and proud of the crops they grow. So the labeling is just it's a bigger thing of how much do we want the USDA to get involved, and is it true anyways? Because right now it's not really.
And Kimmy, that's a really excellent point, because is it really true that organic wheat from Brazil or China is the same quality, really organic, like organic wheat from Kansas? Because the organic certifier is paid to certify the grower, and in some countries, that fidelity is not as true as it is, I think, in the United States, and that really could reduce the value of big organic. I mean, when Walmart starts selling organic, there is some impact on the organic marketplace, and that leads us into natural, and there's no real on labeling for natural. There's no real definition for natural, so it all comes back to buyer beware. The consumer needs to have more ability to understand where their food comes, they're feeding their families. And this is something that we want to talk about, a thread through all of our episodes in these discussions. It's just that the consumer needs to know more about their food.
One more item that I'd like to make sure that we hit on, we'd be remiss if we missed this, is we're in the space, we're talking about the labeling, whether it be organic or natural, whether it come from the United States or wherever. So let's localize this a little bit more to Colorado. And the Colorado Proud system also has a labeling program where they say, hey, this was made in Colorado. So the consumer sees Colorado Proud, made in Colorado. And it's not always true here in the state of Colorado as well. I was with a farmer recently, and they showed me some bags from a bean company. And they said, you see this? Look, these are Colorado Proud. Customer believes that these are grown right here in Colorado. And he said, you can't grow these beans here in the state of Colorado. I won't say who the company is, won't say who the farmer was. But nonetheless, this isn't just a national or international problem. Right here in Colorado, we're feeding into it as well.
Okay, now it's time to move to the guest discussion portion of our show. And we're going to welcome back our panel and our guest, Bill Mahoney. So take it away, Vern.
And so that everybody knows, every week, each of the panel, Kimberly, Nathan, and I get to pick the guest. Well, I won this time. And I picked Bill Mahoney. I've known Bill, I don't know, probably 7 or 8, 9 years. Bill works at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. A lot of people know it as NCAR. It's the big old building up by the Flatirons. Bill is the director of the Research Application Laboratory. Bill, I'm going to let you describe a little bit more background, what RAL does specifically, and what you as a director, what role you play there.
Well, yeah, thank you, Vern, and it's a pleasure to be here. So thanks for the invitation. A little bit on the National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR. We are a national laboratory and primarily sponsored by the National Science Foundation. And we're run by a not-for-profit organization called the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. We've been in existence in Boulder since about 1960. And our primary mission is to do fundamental and applied research on the Earth system, primarily on weather and climate. To support the university community, we have supercomputers, we have research aircraft like a Gulfstream 5, we have a C-130 aircraft, we've had sailplanes in the past. We use those to do field projects all over the world. And my lab, the Research Applications Laboratory, is focused on making sure that science is made useful to society, to decision makers, to end users. So we're really a leader in end-to-end research, from fundamental science right to creating decision support systems for decision makers across aviation. For example, when you're flying, these days you have wind shear detection systems that were developed by my laboratory. We have icing and turbulence products that are used by the FAA, the pilots, and dispatchers across the country. We do water management, water prediction, flood prediction that's used by the National Weather Service. We do severe weather modeling and provide those capabilities and transfer those to NOAA and the National Weather Service. We're big in advancing air quality predictions around the world. For national security, we develop bio and chemical plume dispersion products to make sure that first responders know what is happening and where the hazards may be to human health. One of the big areas of growth for us in the last several years is wind and solar energy prediction. As more states and utilities mix wind and solar energy into their energy generation mix, they need to have really accurate predictions of how much energy is likely to come from the wind and the sun and what times a day, and how it's going to blend with traditional fossil fuel sources. And we develop products for the utilities, and those are being used on a daily basis. In Colorado, Xcel Energy is a big user of those products every day. We also have a big program in predicting land surface, that's soil moisture, soil temperature. We have crop modeling that we do to really support the precision agriculture field and making sure that chemicals are used optimally, seeds are used and chosen optimally. We know what the soil conditions are going to be, so fertilizer and pesticides are used optimally, et cetera. And then we do climate change research as well, which has been interesting to see really how extreme weather events are likely to change going into the future and what the previous climate was like decades ago and even longer. So it's a very dynamic, very user-oriented research organization that I run, and we really love to work with stakeholders to help them address some of their problems.
So, Bill, but one of the things that fascinated me, and as a disclaimer, I did some consulting for the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research that, as Bill said, manages NCAR on a contract with the National Science Foundation, and that's how I came in contact with Bill 8 or 9 years ago. But Bill, NCAR also does space weather research. Talk just 60 seconds about that.
Oh, sure, no problem. Yeah, NCAR has several laboratories. One of them is focused on the physics of the sun and how the sun interacts with the Earth and all the charged particles you hear about, and the concerns from organizations that have satellites in space about space weather and solar flares and how they're going to affect communication satellites, et cetera. As a matter of fact, just recently we've had a very dynamic sun that has produced a lot of auroras, and auroras that can be seen as far south as Colorado in the recent weeks. So we do have a part of our organization. It was actually the first laboratory at NCAR to look at the sun and its impact on the earth. And we have a telescope on the top of Mauna Loa in Hawaii that is constantly looking at the sun and how it's changing and affecting the upper atmosphere. So space weather is a bigger deal. The more and more space assets we have in space that are vulnerable to solar flares, solar ejections, charged particles, et cetera, the more we need to know about what the effects might be on our infrastructure.
And as we all can instinctively understand, that agriculture really looking for more predictable, moderate weather patterns. And that's why I've asked Bill to be here with us, is that weather and food are interconnected. As we talked earlier about changing weather patterns and food security, these need to start being policy discussions, more than just our mundane politics crap. So, and that's why Bill's here. So Bill, one thing I've always been fascinated about is how in the world can these Arctic blasts end up all the way down to Miami and killing off all of our orange groves?
Yeah, one of the interesting studies that are going on now is with greenhouse gases increasing the temperature of the Earth a bit. How is that changing the distribution of heat between the equator and the poles? And as ice melts at the poles, and you have more water exposed, the temperature extremes between the equator and the North Pole are reduced. And it's that temperature extreme that actually causes the jet stream, which is the high-speed winds in the upper atmosphere that predominantly blow from west to east. But what we've been seeing in the last several decades, anyway, is a general slowdown in the jet stream, which then allows the pattern to become more snake-like. You have higher ridges, more troughs in the North Pole and the South Pole as well, and the cold air that is typically held up above in the Arctic area, because the winds are swirling pretty much straight from west to east. With those weakening, and you get this more, we call it meridional flow, the north-south flow, south-north flow, you get these really strong troughs and ridges across the globe, and that brings the cold air further south and the warm air further north. And these patterns can at times become somewhat stable, in which you have extreme cold on one side and extreme heat on the other. So this is still a theory. We only have a few decades to look at to see whether or not this is a long-term trend or shorter-term trend. But if, in fact, we lose more ice and we have temperature changes between the equator and poles that are not as extreme as they used to be, a weakening jet stream could mean at times that you're going to have more extreme weather as the cold air is able to descend further south.
So basically, one or two of these events at the wrong time in the spring could impact the blossoms on our orange groves in Florida, caused by changing ice pack in the Arctic. Is that a conclusion that's true?
Yeah, that's possibly true. And climate has been studied at pretty gross scales, broad scales, not in high detail, just because the supercomputers aren't fast enough to model the Earth from top to bottom at really high resolution. So what we're doing now in the science field is we're trying to resolve the weather scales out decades into the future, because everyone really wants to know, how is the weather going to change in the future? I think most people have realized that, we've seen a relatively small but growing trend in the temperatures on average around the Earth. But what really is important is trying to understand how the weather is going to change, and we need to have higher resolution models to capture that. So trying to understand the microclimates that may come from changes in the overall climate of the Earth is a very big focus of ours.
Are some of these trends that we're seeing, what's happening in California right now, kind of speak to what we're seeing with these atmospheric rivers and stuff like that, what we're seeing just within the last weeks and continuing in California this year?
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges for us is, the Earth is more than 1 billion years old, and we have a scientific record of 100 and 150 years. And so we really are trying to understand, is what we're seeing in the last century or so something that's never happened before, or something that hasn't happened for thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years or even millions of years. So this is all about natural variability, and how does a climate signal layer on top of natural variability. So when we have patterns we typically have a pattern on the Earth of about like a 15-year phase of drier, followed by a 15-year phase of wetter in North America. That's natural variability. What happens if you add a degree or two of additional temperature onto that? Does it change it? Does it change the overall pattern? It's hard to tell at this point, but there is some concerns that we'll see longer periods of drought, and we'll see in some areas higher precipitation amounts. A warmer atmosphere can hold much more water. And out to the next 25 years, we're anticipating that thunderstorms, for example, might hold 20% more volume of water, which means that when you do get precipitation events, they can drop a lot more water on you than they would if the atmosphere was just a few degrees cooler. So we're trying to understand all these micro changes that could occur under a lot of different scenarios. And but we do know a warmer atmosphere is going to drink more water. A weaker jet stream is going to create more extremes. But we can't say exactly yet what we're seeing every day. How can you attribute that to climate change, or is that part of natural variability? But and that's something the society is certainly asking for, is how do you differentiate the two? We heard stories from our grandparents, of course. Well, we were walking barefoot to school, and the snow was always 2 feet deep, and it was cold. And well, we did have extreme weather events back in the early days, and a lot of those stories were passed on by our parents and elders, et cetera. And we're probably passing some of our stories on to our kids, but we're really trying to understand what is really changing in our weather, or are we just forgetting the extreme events that may be caused by climate change or not? So climate attribution is a brand new area of science, but we need a lot more data to really understand with confidence what the signal is for climate change on top of what the Earth and Mother Nature likes to throw at us on a regular basis.
So about how many countries right now is RAL dealing with for a project of some kind?
Well, we work all over the world, so thank you for bringing that up. We are in about 12 countries right now, and the work we're doing in various countries is about as variable as the total portfolio of research that we do. For example, in Italy, we have projects right now that are focused on improving renewable energy prediction, wind energy prediction in particular. In Taiwan, it's all about aviation safety, making sure that when you fly through Taiwan airspace, you're going to avoid thunderstorms, turbulence, icing at the upper levels, et cetera. In some of the work we're doing in the UK, it's just helping to understand weather prediction and how to advance weather prediction models. Same kind of thing we do with the National Weather Service in the United States. In Iceland, we had a recent project where it was all about hydrologic prediction. How do you predict how the melting water is flowing through the glaciers? And how do you capture that water, and where does it go, and how do you deal with the hydrologic cycle, et cetera? In the United Arab Emirates, we're doing projects right now looking at improvements to weather prediction, improvements to dust storm prediction, et cetera. So it's quite variable. It's related to weather, it's related to climate in some areas, but there is a global need for improved information to support everything we do. And agriculture is certainly one of those areas that we need to focus more on and really understand how the extreme weather events that we've been seeing may change in the future, and how it's going to affect agriculture globally, because it's a very connected system. And food security is a growing area of concern to almost everybody in the country. You get a lot of civil unrest in areas where you have droughts and you have issues with food security. And from a global security perspective, understanding agriculture and all of the supply chain issues is extremely important.
Didn't you guys do a study a couple of years ago for USDA about that very topic of climate variations and impact on global and U.S. food supply?
Yeah, we did. We teamed up with 19 organizations, several federal agencies, non-government organizations, universities, private organizations, to really look at the global supply chain and climate change and food security. And it was one of the first times to kind of look at this from an end-to-end perspective. We are such an integrated society. It's unbelievable. And over the decades, we were kind of moving from a commodity distribution system that had a lot of storage to one that we heard about quite a bit in the 80s and early 90s, the just-in-time delivery of everything. Well, just-in-time works great if everything in your supply chain is working and connected, and it's a well-oiled machine, and there are no disruptions. But the tighter the market got and the more interdependent the supply chain became, then you start finding out where your vulnerabilities are. And in agriculture and food security, one bad drought in one area of the world that produces a crop that's needed, whether it be wheat or corn, soybeans, et cetera, can really affect the supply chain. The commodities then have to be found elsewhere, and the need for the food satisfied in other countries, other markets. Just changing the source of food and all the regulations around that makes any disruption challenging. And we've seen in the many years problems with drought in Australia. We've seen problems with drought in the central United States. And now, of course, we have a war in Ukraine, which is the breadbasket of that part of the world. And there are concerns about supply chains there. Whenever commodity prices go up, it's harder for people to purchase food, and then the poorest among us are challenged, and poverty increases. So really understanding the supply chain and how to build resiliency into it is something that needs additional focus.
All right, Nathan and Kimberly, I've kind of hogged everything, so I'll turn it over to you, Nathan, to talk about your microclimates and so forth. I'll try to be quiet for a second.
You say microclimates, and I mean, just listening to everything that Bill said, Bill, I've probably got a couple hundred questions now. I know we don't have that amount of time. My goodness, I love how fascinating all this stuff is. I could really nerd out on everything that you've been talking about. You started to talk about the sun, and I was going to ask a question about the big hole in the sun that we're hearing about right now in the news, but just keeping in theme with what we're talking about, I wanted to ask a little bit about water. So in California, we're getting the atmospheric river. We're getting all of the major water events, and so I'm reading a little bit about how the reservoirs are filling back up, and that's great. It's going to be a little bit hotter than it's been in years past, so we're going to lose a lot to evaporation. So I want to know. I read a really cool article about a farmer who just, instead of stopping the water, just said, hey, flood my land. Let's put it back in the ground. Let's increase the groundwater. So I want to hear what effect long-term do you think? And when I say long-term, let me rephrase that. This year, are they going to have enough water in California to feed us again? And how does desalination ever come into effect? Will we ever see big scale desalination that actually does something to impact our dwindling water resources?
Yeah, really good questions. It is interesting when we've seen long-term droughts recently that go on for years and years and years, and then they always seem to be broken by major wet events. It just seems to break it. That happened in Colorado too about a decade ago. We had years of drought. We were getting to the critical state of not having enough water, not only for farming, and for your yards, but also for drinking. And then we had a March snowstorm that dumped 8 to 10 feet of snow in the areas where we collect water in the mountains of Colorado. And the pattern kind of just settled back into something that was a little more normal after that. We got the reservoirs filled up, and then next thing you know, our weather for several years after that wasn't very extreme. In California, we're seeing a very similar thing happening. Years of drought, Again, I mentioned that 15-year drought cycle, warm cycle, cool cycle. Clearly, in the 1930s, during the dust storms, we're one of those drought cycles, and now we're seeing a pattern hitting California that is going a long way to really help fill the reservoirs and also to saturate the soils. So that's a good thing. I think what you're going to be hearing soon is how important it is to capture more of that water so that when these extreme events occur, you can capture it and not lose it out to the ocean, because fresh water is always going to be in need, and you hate to see too much of it running away and just going into the ocean. So in Colorado and in the West, where it's pretty dry, I think more water capture is something that's going to be needed. As for groundwater, it's interesting. A lot of our hydrologic models that we develop now, we certainly focus on surface water, what's in the rivers and streams from the headwaters to the ocean. But we also want to know what's in the soils and what's in the subsurface regions and the aquifers. So some of the things we're trying to put into our models these days are even the tile drainage systems that you see in the bread baskets of the country, and how that moves water from the sky to the ground, and then it's distributed through these tile drainage systems to keep the soil from being too wet and to moving the water to where you want it. Typically, that hasn't been part of our hydrologic prediction systems, but it goes a long way into taking that water, moving it to someplace else. It's not available for evaporation. It's not going to feed the next thunderstorm the next day, but we got to keep track of where all the water's going. So in terms of subsurface, a lot of the water that is used for irrigation is coming from wells all over the country. It's coming from wells. And yeah, we are certainly losing water due to that process and deep storage. So we need to come up with different strategies to replenish the aquifers and the subsurface water that we're just taking out constantly. And when some of these aquifers dry up, there really isn't any other sources in a lot of different parts of the country. So if you can't get it from a reservoir through channels and irrigation, there's really going to be no other choice other than let the fields go dry and maybe plant crops that can grow and live and be sustained by nature's provision of water. So it's a big challenge, and it is interesting, and I agree, it's interesting to hear that some farmers and maybe some other jurisdictions are looking at ways of taking that water and damming it up, flooding fields, letting some of it soak in as deep as they can, because these events are rare and we need to take advantage of them when we get them.
Yes.
So look, Nathan, any more questions?
Is desalination, is it going to do something? Or we actually, when I say we, Kimberly and I have a really good friend who worked in water. I don't know if it was water reclamation or cleaning, but nonetheless in California. And whenever we've asked him about desalination, he said, it's so expensive. The amount of resources that go into it, there's the trade-off's not really there right now. And he's not just talking about the money, but he's talking about the actual other resources that go into to that. Are there advances? Is desalination something that's gonna be a reality that helps us with water management throughout the world in the next decade?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in that technology, although we've done work in the Middle East in which we're aware that there are those facilities in the Middle East where fresh water is hard to come by, and there's plenty of salt water from the oceans and seas. It is expensive. I would imagine that the cost will eventually come down if there's sufficient demand and the building of a lot of factories to create desalinated water. I think, it's hard to scale up to like an irrigation level process, but it certainly has been used more for dealing with shortages in tap water, drinking water.
Okay.
So I think as the shortages of fresh water start to accumulate, replacing freshwater sources with desalination processes is likely the first step. Whether they can scale it up to really cover a large area for crop crop management and crop growth. That's still to be determined.
Okay.
Look, I think we're out of time, Bill. We're obviously going to be bringing you back. We've only begun to touch the surface, but at least we've given our viewers some insight to the deep connection between weather and food and water, and that there are some research institutions that are really working to get a handle on this globally, nationally, and locally. So thank you, Bill. Again, we reserve the right to call you up and ask you weird questions again in the future. So,
well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And we do like doing something about the weather and not just talking about it.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us, Bill. And thank you for our local food, TV, and radio panel. They will be joining us again in the next episode. So make sure to stick around and join us next time.